Hey, James here. So I am currently recording this from my room. Actually, to be more specific, I'm in my closet because I read online that if you're in a smaller room with more things in the room, it will help the acoustics. And my wife is taking a shower, and I told her that she can't come back in the room for 20 minutes because I don't want to have the squeaking doors and the sound of the shower on the recording. So I want to express some gratitude to her for allowing that to be possible. And this is all for you, the listeners. So I appreciate you being here with me, but I only have 20 minutes because she's going to come knocking on the door. What I wanted to talk about today was communication, and something that comes up a lot when I'm doing work as a psychotherapist or teaching mindfulness. This same kind of message comes to mind over and over and over again. And what comes to mind and what I share with clients and people that are participating in my meditation class is the hardest, the most important things are the hardest things to say. Another way of saying it is the most important things that would be the most important to share with other people are the most difficult for us to express. And I wanted to kind of look at why that is. And when I think about it, it brings me to a story that sometimes I share in my classes. When I was on one of my, I guess I'll say retreats, or it was a seminar, a long seminar type thing, where I was learning to become a mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher. And one of the exercises we did, it was the first day we got there. It was a 9-day, seminar where we would stay there for 9 days in intensive practice and do experiential exercises to learn to teach. So it was with 62 people total participating in the class, and there were 4 teachers, and I had never met any of these people before. So I walk into this room, and it's 67 strangers or 65 strangers. And on the first night of this experiential learning, we did this exercise that was, I believe they said that it was inspired by a Native American tradition. And they had us walk around the room in no specific order. It was a big, grand room, and there were no chairs or anything in the room, just cushions pushed to the side of the wall, and 62 strangers walking around in no specific order. And you take a left or a right, you go straight, and then every once in a while the teachers would ring the bell. And when they rang the bell, you'd have to stop where you were and connect with the closest person to you and stop and look at each other directly in the eyes. And one of the people would have to say, "I am here." And the other person would have to respond by saying, "I see you." And then we would switch, and the person who hadn't said it first would then look in the other stranger's eyes, from very close distance, might I add, and say, "I am here." And the other person had to stop and say, "I see you." And then you would stop and you'd walk around again, and then they'd ring the bell, and it was another stranger. And I wanted to share about my experience with this exercise because I think that it kind of relates to why the most important things to say are the most difficult. When I was doing this exercise, what was going through my mind was, get me the hell out of here. It was the most vulnerable I had felt in a long time, if not ever. Just imagine yourself walking around a room with 62 strangers and a bell ringing and then stopping and getting a few feet away at most. Some people had a different idea of what amount of space should be between us. So it could be as close as, 2 feet away or 1 foot away. And we looked at each other's eyes, directly into the eyes of a stranger, paused and looked at each other and said, "I see you." Or the one person said, "I am here." and the other person said, I see you. And I don't know if you can imagine what that would feel like for you, but for me, it was totally vulnerable, totally uncomfortable. It's like I don't have a lot of times where I look even my family or my best friends or my wife in the eyes for in that capacity. It's a very intimate place to be where you're just looking directly in someone else's eyes. And there's a lot in me during that experience that wanted to run the hell away. Because there was something about that vulnerability, about that intimacy that is, or was for me, extremely frightening. And I think you might find this true for yourself if you look closely, or maybe not, but I think a lot of people have similar experiences where if you're putting yourself in a vulnerable or intimate situation, with that intimacy can come this fear, this intense fear to want to be out of this vulnerable or intimate situation. But what I learned in that experience that has stuck with me forever is that on the other side of that coin, of that fear of me wanting to run the hell away from that vulnerable and intimate place, was one of the deepest connections I've ever felt with a complete stranger. And for them to stand across from me, and when I said, I am here, and for them to say, I see you, it was a deep recognition that doesn't happen in everyday life. So they're not separate. That the part of that situation where I am feeling completely vulnerable and intimate is not separate from that fear. That intimacy and deep connection couldn't happen if that fear wasn't also there. They live in the same house, so to speak. Meaning if I wasn't pushing myself to stand within that fear and that tendency to run away, I wouldn't also feel that deep connection. I think this relates to communication. There are a lot of situations that I hear of and that I go through myself where people won't tell the people that they love the most that they love them, or the people that they're the most thankful for. They won't often stop and thank those people. Look them in the eyes and say, I appreciate you. Thank you. I love you. And I notice this in my own life at times. People that I'm grateful for, people that work for me, or people that are in my family or my friends, when I feel a certain way about somebody, like I'm grateful or thankful, thank you for what you have done, I will have this subtle tendency to not go there. And it's similar to that experience that I had on that retreat, because something in me is afraid. There's a fear of being intimate or vulnerable. But what I remember from that retreat and what guides me in my life and communication is that if I can work through that fear of being intimate, being vulnerable in that way, and I can share that gratitude, the connection between me and that other person grows in a deep way. Like if you think about it on a scale, the amount of fear that is there for being vulnerable and intimate in that way is very big. So on the other side of that coin, or the other side of that scale, is a big amount of connection. But I think we see this a lot in our society. I see a lot of patterns of this in the people that I work with in psychotherapy and in the mindfulness work, is that it's difficult to communicate the most important messages. And a lot of times we'll dance around, if we're angry at one thing, we might communicate another thing. Let's say a father and a daughter get into a fight, and the father believes that after thinking about it for a little while, maybe he shouldn't have acted the way that he did, and he wants to make up with his daughter. So he goes out and he buys her favorite muffin, and he comes home and the daughter's all angry in her room, thinking he's such a jerk and he shouldn't have said that. And then the father knocks on the door very quietly and cracks the door open. He says, "Hey, I bought your favorite muffins." And the daughter, maybe she's angry at first and she's thinking, well, how could you be thinking about muffins right now? Because, how could you not be addressing the conversation we had? I'm still mad at you. And what the father what he's doing is offering her favorite muffin. But what he means underneath is, I'm sorry. But it's very difficult to make ourselves vulnerable in that way. And to say, I'm sorry, and that I care about you, and that I was wrong, or even if you don't believe you were wrong, for the thing that's more important than the argument to be that you care about that person and that you want to be close to them. I mean, that's really the message under all of this. A lot of these fights that I see that come up between people and between myself and people in my life, what's underneath it is this message of like, I want to be close to you right now. And there's a distance between us that is resulting from this argument. But it's so hard to stop and explore and look at the message underneath and recognize underneath all of this, the thing that's getting me the most worked up is not about what they said. It's about I'm feeling distance between me and somebody that I care about right now, and I feel lonely. And I feel hurt. And I feel angry at myself for having hurt them and for having caused this distance with them. But communicating these things is much more difficult. And it's difficult to recognize these things happening. I think that's where the mindfulness practice has served me a lot, to recognize what's underneath. Like in therapy we call it manifest content and latent content. Like what are we saying and what do we mean underneath it? But I think all of this boils down to maybe the next time you get into an argument with somebody or you get angry at somebody and you find that it's difficult to communicate with them, maybe stop and reflect on what is really bothering you. Like maybe it's not so much that something that they said about, I don't know, your shirt or, something on the surface, but it's like pause and reflect a little. I use this analogy in when I'm working with my clients in therapy of the teapot. When you boil water, a teapot will get really hot. And it takes a little while for the teapot to cool down, even if you've taken it off the water. So if you need, you can give yourself time for the teapot to cool off. And then once the teapot has cooled off, you can stop and reflect and look at what is making it so hard for me to communicate what I'm trying to communicate? Or what is the breakdown here? And maybe underneath it's some really vulnerable place for you, like I'm feeling distant from someone I love right now. And maybe what would be the antidote or the soothing ointment for that would be for you to communicate to that person, I feel distant from you right now, and I care about you, and I want us to be close together. But that can be very, very difficult to say. But I challenge you and myself to explore what's underneath and try to communicate in this way with someone and look at, this argument is really stemming from, I feel distant from you, or I feel some deeper insecurity within myself. And if you're able to touch that space within you emotionally and communicate it to yourself and to the other person, we're sort of walking through the fear that's guiding us. And instead of living in fear and avoiding out of fear, we are walking through the fear, and that is with courage. And on the other side of that fear is this deep connection that I think I've experienced on that retreat, or whenever I'm communicating something deeply like this with somebody that I love or care about. On the other side of that fear and vulnerability is a deep connection. So that's kind of why I think it is. It's very difficult to communicate the most important things. And another way of saying it is the most important things are the most difficult to say. But I challenge you to maybe look at something you haven't said, something you've been meaning to say and you haven't said. And I'll challenge myself as well and see what is it really that's getting in the way of you communicating that. And if you can work up the courage to work through the fear to communicate it, see if you can explore the connection that arises with it, that is not separate from you walking through that fear. Okay, I think that's all on this for today. If you remember, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you have a family member or a friend who you think would benefit from this, from listening to this talk, I would appreciate that as well. Okay, thanks for being with me.